Welcome to the podcast that's dedicated to helping business owners prepare for exit so you can maximize value and exit on your terms. This is the Exit Insight podcast presented by Succession Plus. I'm Daryl Bates-Brownsword, and today I'm talking to Jerome Fogel, and Jerome's a lawyer from Fogle and Patomianos based in Los Angeles. Hey, welcome, Jerome, and thanks for joining me today.
Daryl, thank you so much for having me on. I'm really glad to be here.
That's great. Now, look, I know it's an early morning for you, so I'll try not to hit you with too many big questions. But hey, Jerome, why don't you give us a little bit of a background about, because I remember when we had our preliminary conversation, there's a really interesting backstory for you and how you got into doing the commercial work you do on the legal side. So can you just frame it up for us and we'll use that as a starting point?
Sure. So one of the great things that I've been able to do is represent all different types of companies and individuals and businesses. And one of the clients that we first started working with, this is about 5 years ago, really came to us with some corporate needs, some intellectual property needs. And I began to assemble really this kind of power team to help our client. And over those 5 years, we developed a process for helping clients, 70-factor process that we developed. And over those 5 years, actually, the client just exited in end of 2021. The client had an exit, and since that time, we've built a really strong mergers and acquisitions practice. We've built a venture capital formation practice. We've built a capital raising practice, and so we work with anywhere from companies from early stage, no valuation, up to $500 million valuation. And we work all across the U.S., mostly in California and Texas.
Okay. So given that, I'm guessing you've seen some things done really well and some exits and owners who have perhaps could benefit from some help, shall we say?
Right. Yeah, I think that a lot of the owners are doing these things for the first time, whereas people like yourself and mine have seen this a number of times. So sometimes you get clients who know what they're doing, but most often not, they need help.
Yeah. And we work in the mid-market type of sector where most business owners in that sector, they're only ever going to do one exit in their lifetime. And that's why we started this podcast. We want to help business owners exit on their terms by bringing in gurus like yourself to share the tips and to help business owners who are going through for the first time, help them be best prepared, because the journey going through an exit is often longer and more arduous and more stressful and painful than they ever thought possible. So that's why we're here, Jerome. So what we want to do is unpack your head and get some tips from you to share with business owners. So have you got, this is going to be really out of the blue, but have you got is there something on the top of your mind and going, hey, here's the top tip. I really wish business owners knew this going into the process.
Yeah, here's really I think the top tip. This is if you're being approached by an institutional buyer. So a private equity group, a public company, Fortune 500, somebody sophisticated. What you need to do as a seller is inspire confidence in your company. And the way you do that is you have all your ducks in a row, from corporate governance, from conception to present. You have, you're ready for third-party consents. You have a very coherent story of your company. The numbers match up and make sense. You do all the things to help the boxes check so that when the institutional buyer rolls up all this data to the top, because they will, it'll check the boxes and they'll inspire confidence and move forward with the deal. I think what I see with sellers is They sometimes play a little loosey-goosey in the sense of they think, oh, well, because what the structure I needed to run my business is good enough for the buyer, but that's not the case. You may run your business one way, but in order for the buyer to purchase your company, it has to be ready a certain way, institutionally ready. So I think that's the big thing. Biggest tip I have for sellers is your company needs to be ready for an institutional buyer, and that's different from your company being profitable and being made for you to grow it.
Right. So you've gone straight for the jugular of exit planning and gone,
right.
Let's set up our business, because the most desirable thing, right, for any business owner is to go, I really want to build this business so that it's that magical strategic exit and a strategic acquirer.
Right.
Which is not a competitor, because a competitor only ever wants to buy your client base and a couple of your staff, really.
Right.
They're not interested in the intangible assets and the extra things that you build in your business. So let's make it attractive to a strategic acquirer. And what you're telling us is you really need to think about the risks to them and how they think in advance. How they're thinking about, if they're going to acquire a business, they have expectations of what's in place. And, so start thinking from their perspective and seeing if you can have a look from their perspective at your business and what all the risks are. And if you can address those, then that puts you in a pretty good position. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You see it from their eyes, and their eyes are different. Oftentimes the people that are institutional, their jobs are on the line. If they push the button on the wrong company, they might lose their job, versus an owner who's calling the shots. So you have to think about, they're thinking about their jobs as this stuff is rolling up. And so you want to inspire confidence every step of the process. You don't what I heard from one law firm that does billion-dollar deals is you don't want it to be a circus, in the sale process.
You want to give them confidence, absolutely. So given that, what are some of the mistakes you see sellers, I guess, doing repeatedly when they're going through the exit journey, and they may have some M&A advisors working with them? What are the common mistakes?
Sure. Well, I think too, I have a ton of compassion and understanding, because to get to this point, you have been a scrappy entrepreneur. You've begun to put management and executives in place, and your company really is an amazing success story. But the skills that made you a successful entrepreneur are not necessarily the same skills that'll successfully sell your company. What do I mean by that? Well, when you're an entrepreneur, you're taking risks, you're kicking out dust, you're making things happen. But really, what the buyer is going to do is put you in this process, what they call a process. And they're going to want your whole company broken down into bits and pieces in a data room so they can analyze it. And so what happens, so that's a whole different thinking. And so I think the number one thing is that you've got to be able to run the business and do the process at the same time, because what happens is something called performance drag, where companies will get so focused on the M&A deal and they'll let the performance drag. And then if that deal doesn't close, then your numbers are down for the next quarter or two. So number one, you've got somebody running the business and somebody running the process. And ideally, you've got people that can help you with that, and you get involved as the business owner when needed, or the CEO. But so number one, you've got to have people doing both. Keep your eye on the ball, continuing to grow the business, but then also you have somebody that's helping with the process. That's like the number one thing. Probably, I would say number two is you have to have a really good advisor team around you, investment banker, CPA, accountant, lawyer, so that they can help you shepherd this deal through I see some business owners who try to do DIY, do it yourself. I had a company that was buying a carve out from a public company, and the CFO wanted to run the deal himself, and it only works to a certain extent, so you really need advisors in the team.
So even if you've got a CFO in your business, you're probably worth looking at getting an interim CFO in just to focus on the deal.
Well, well, maybe, but I'm just saying that even if you have a CFO, you want to have an outside accounting team that's looking at the tax issues, that deals with M&A on a constant basis. I think CFOs are great, but you want somebody who all they do day in and day out is do M&A and do GAAP and non-GAAP definitions and going through the APA and the terms, and you want somebody that specializes in this to be on the team. You want a specialist more so than a generalist sometimes. And you want the CFO involved, but you don't want them running the deal and not having any outside advisors.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially like if we've got a one bite at this, if we're as the owner, the founder of the business getting distracted by the deal, and that's taken our eyes off the ball of the business, maintaining its growth and its financial performance, there's two red flags there, or two potential risks. One is that the business is too dependent on my involvement in operations and keeping the business running, and two is that, as you say, if the deal goes down, then my financial performance is down for 2 or 3 quarters, and that's set things back another 6 or 12 months.
That's a great point, because the valuation is going to be based on trailing 12 months, essentially. And that's where the multiple is going to be derived out of. And so if you go down a quarter or two, you're resetting the value again. And then to your other point, which is really good, buyers are going to look at the management team. Now, it depends. I mean, if it's a platform company that is buying this and they're doing an add-on, it may be a little different, but they do want to buy the management team, and they don't want, if the company is so reliant on the CEO, that's a problem, right? They want a company that has systems in place that can grow and it's not dependent on a genius with 1,000 helpers.
Exactly. So what are some of the things that buyers look for? Just some things there that buyers, especially these strategic buyers, are looking for that founders or owners just haven't considered. They've neglected and haven't got in place.
Yeah, I think one of the first things is, in terms of the intellectual property, you have to look at the perspective of the buyer. The buyer is going to have an IP team that's going to look at, how do we tear down your patents? How do we blow up your trademarks? They're going to look to poke holes in all these things. Yeah. And so it's really important to have somebody with an eye for intellectual property to put the buyer hat on. And before you go to market, saying, okay, looking at your IP portfolio, what do we need to do to protect this portfolio, whether national or international, in order so that that we can't tear down the patent, or we can't circumvent the trademarks, whatever it is, you need somebody with an IP eye to look at that with a totally different angle. I'll give you an example. We had a client that was trying to get a patent for years, 6 or 7 years. It was a really important patent. One of our attorneys came in within a year or year and a half, had that patent registered with the United States Patent Trademark Office, but also built a family of patents around that, and really protected this client. And when the client went to sale, the IP never came up as an issue. The buyer never once said, "Oh, we're concerned about your patent. We've read through the prior art." Not one question was brought up. But I can guarantee you, the sophisticated the sophisticated buyer wants a competitive advantage, and they're going to look with a magnifying glass and a fine-tooth comb through all of the IP. So I would say number one is, having a expert eye on the IP. The number two thing is you really need a very clean ownership cap table corporate governance structure. What I mean by that is a buyer wants to know that they're buying the company unencumbered. And if you have all these oral and other deals floating around, it will concern the buyer, especially if corporate governance isn't locked up. The third thing, and this is probably the biggest thing, is something called third-party consents. The first thing an institutional buyer is going to ask in the first meeting is they're going to try to figure out what are the third-party consents to the deals, meaning do banks need to sign off on this deal? Are there certain key vendors or critical relationship? Are there government consents that are needed? Because they know that third-party consents are the most difficult, because the third party has no horse in the race. They don't have the incentive and the sense of urgency that the seller and the buyer do to get the deal done. So the really strategic buyer is going to nail down what are the third-party consents, and they want to get those addressed. And sometimes a deal will not close if the third-party consents are not in place. So you need to address those very early.
So Jerome, that sounds critical. Is it? Can you spell that out a bit more? Like, are we talking debt in place? Maybe there's covenants on the owner's got his property.
Yeah.
And some examples there.
So an example here. Let's say the seller has a line of credit. Well, in order for the seller to, and because there's a line of credit, there is basically what's called a UCC, Uniform Commercial Code, security interest in probably the inventory or other property. So that lien needs to get released before the buyer can buy the company.
Yep.
So in order to get the lien released, you need to get a letter basically from the bank stating that either the lien is released or that upon payment of X dollars and the lien will be released in a promissory letter. So they want that in writing. A second thing would be a government consent. If the company is big enough and this administration's been more active in antitrust, you could have a potential antitrust issue. And so you need to get the antitrust write-off. If this is happening right now in the U.S. There's a couple of deals that are going on right now where essentially I believe it's the Kroger Albertsons, where they're essentially the antitrust office is saying, no, we're not going to let this deal go through. So they have to fight this. So that's a bigger one. But basically issues like that where the deal can't close unless there's a consent from a third party.
So for most, antitrust not going to be a big issue for most mid-market sort of businesses selling businesses. So okay, so we've prepared well in advance. We've looked at all our debt structures. We've talked to our third parties. We've negotiated and planned to make sure that that's not going to be an issue. What role should the founders play? Because when it comes to negotiating on the deal, because it's their life's work. They feel they know their business better than anyone. They feel potentially that they know the value. From a negotiation perspective, what are your thoughts on how that rolls out?
Yeah, I think that the bigger the deal is, I think the further removed the CEO becomes in some of the negotiations. And what I mean by that is, if it's a solo business owner with a small team, if any team, he's probably going to be negotiating the deal. If it's a, $100-200 million company that's, selling in the mid-market range, you've got an investment banker basically negotiating the deal, and going to have some sophisticated analysis and numbers. And so I think at that point, you really let the bankers negotiate the pricing deals, and the attorneys negotiate the finer points, the reps and warranties, and the asset purchase and other agreements. So that said, what I tell every seller is, this is your life's work. I want you to take an afternoon off, and I want you to read the asset purchase agreement, the stock purchase agreement, whatever it is. Even if you don't understand it all, I want you to read it, because you know what? You might see something that we don't see, or you might catch something or understand something that we don't, and we want you to at least know what's in there. And I think that is something where you do want them involved, and you want them to understand what's going on. But like I said, the bigger the deal is, the more removed the CEO will be from that negotiating process.
Okay, and so the bigger the deal, the more likely that the CEO and founder is going to be out of it. But what about on those sort of smaller end of the smaller side of mid market, where there's one or two owners that built it up over 30 years? They feel a little more attached, and they see someone going in and negotiating, and perhaps they feel that they can talk the buyer up, or just because they're personally attached to it, and they may start taking offence and getting personally offended, or maybe even concerned that they feel that the deal's going to drop out, and just wanting to fear in the buying process, just because they're founders and they like to meddle. Let's face it. Because entrepreneurs can always do everything better. But this is something they haven't done before, and this is really important to their business. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought you were going to say, my tip is, go and take an afternoon off while we do the job. But what's your advice? What's your experience when owners want to meddle and get in the way of you?
And I think my point with that is, I really want the owners to focus on the business. And I want them to be more hands off, because they do get attached and there's feelings involved. And that's why, soccer players, American football players, they have agents negotiating their deals, even from the smallest to the top. Because that person is going to be more objective and going to be able to interface more effectively. So, I think that, again, this is the first time the entrepreneur's doing this, usually, and you leave it to experts who do this day in and day out, and they're going to probably get a better deal for you. And they can take some of the blows, and they'll be able to take some of the things that may be said in a way that they wouldn't get offended, and they'd be able to focus on the deal. Whereas an owner might get hurt if somebody talks of something about the business and lowers the value. And you just have somebody that's professionally does this for a living, negotiating the terms for you. And as a CEO, you get involved if something were to happen, and you have the relational equity with the buyer, that you've shook their hand and looked them in the eye. Yeah, you get involved, but I really want the CEO just focusing on the business. And obviously you discussed with the investment banker and the attorneys the deal that's being negotiated, and you'll talk about it and you make the final decision. But in terms of the lead negotiating, leave that to the professionals. Even if it's a smaller company, leave it to the professionals. Don't get sidetracked with this, because this is going to take you off the ball of the business, and you're not going to do as good of a job.
Keep the business rolling. Let these guys do it. And I guess what a lot of business owners out there, the question in their mind at the moment is how much of the negotiation is tactical? How much are the negotiations, I guess, a bit of a game and being gamified, and a bit of a dance, if you like, as opposed to just here's my offer. That's what we think.
Yeah, I think a really good investment banker is going to get the goal is to get a number of buyers to the table to get a competitive bidding situation. And so there's really two things you're negotiating. One is the sale price, and two, and this is important now because the cost of money is higher. How much of the sale is upfront in cash, and how much is going to be an earnout due to a valuation gap you may have or a financing gap? How much is going to be financed, right? So I think those are the main two things you need to negotiate. So a good investment banker is going to get a wide range of buyers, get a competitive bidding process, and then help you select, okay, which buyer lines up with what your goals are, whether it's the money, the legacy, the people in the company, the mission, whatever it is, find the right buyer. And then now it's negotiating, well, how much of this is going to be cash versus earnout? And the investment banker is going to have, and the lawyer will have the data to help make those arguments. Whereas the seller doesn't have really the context to understand how to negotiate that part of the deal.
Okay. So what about how much influence does it play in the deal formation with I guess age and risk profile related to age of the seller? Does various risk profiles or perception of risk affect things or influence things a lot?
Sure. So the way I kind of look at these things is I try to really simplify it for a buyer. I kind of tell them, because you've got some buyers who are cowboys. I mean, some buyers, some entrepreneurs who are just total cowboys and want to take all the risk in the world. And then you've got some entrepreneurs who want to read every document and color code everything and comment and go through every detail. So you kind of have a really wide spectrum. And so the way I break it down is I talk about red light, yellow light, green light. And I just say, hey, okay, a red light means, hey, there's some serious red flags about this deal. And, Jerome, you need to really proceed with caution. And I'm not really sure about this deal or this company. A yellow light is, not really sure if this is the right fit. Maybe the buyer maybe doesn't really understand the business as well as they should. The offer might look good on the surface, but there's a big earnout or whatnot, like yellow light. Green light is there's tons of fit. I like the buyer. I think this is a go. Make the deal happen. And so on that spectrum, it's really sort of helping the buyer, number one, understand how they feel about it. But then number two, help them understand, do they have this deal in the right category? Because sometimes a buyer might think it's a green light when it should be a yellow or a red. And so it's my job to help them help understand where they're coming from, but then also help them put it in the right category so we're all on the same page. Because we've seen, you and I, Daryl, we've seen more deals. We can tell this deal, hey, this buyer maybe is a real estate fund. They maybe know nothing about the consumer product industry, and they're getting into a new deal. Well, likely this is a yellow red light situation because when they start to do due diligence, they're not going to understand how the business operates. Whereas a strategic who's doing, let's say, an add-on acquisition, perfectly understands what this market is and will be able to take advantage.
Okay. So, Jerome, where have we got to in our conversation? The first thing I think, if I'm going to summarize, is first one is prepare your business in advance. Once you've prepared your business, you need to think about your business, how a potential buyer or acquirer might be looking at your business, and try and assess the risks from their perspective and what will put them off, proceeding with your business. Surround yourself. The next point that you shared was about surrounding yourself with the right sort of advisors, and CFOs and legal and all the right sort of people who specialize in M&A and are doing this every day, especially if it's your first rodeo trying to do things. Don't be cute. Leave the negotiation, frame up things with your advisors and go, this is what you want. This These are go, no-go gauges. So here's your planning. Here's what you do and don't want to do. Have a risk management framework for assessing so that it's not just gut feel. So that way you can qualify and clarify what the buyers are thinking, because you've got some sort of checklist and questionnaire. So you're putting them through due diligence as much as they're putting you through due diligence. I think that's pretty much what we covered.
Great summary. Yeah.
and the more we plan and prepare these things, Oh, and the other big one that you mentioned, that how could I forget this one, is if you need any third party consent, this is part of looking through the buyer's lens and what the buyer's risks are. If there's any third party consent, make sure you've got that risk addressed well up front. And the other one, you've covered so much ground, Jerome. The other one was all about your IP. Make sure that any IP and intellectual property, and I think you've even mentioned, or this may have been in our pre-conversation, right down to images on your website. Make sure that there's no issues relating to those, that you've got full license to use those, assuming they're third-party images and not your own. But your IP, make sure that you've got that tucked away, and so that it's so well protected and secured and neat and tidy that no one's even going to raise questions about it.
That's right.
So I think that's everything. And while that's fresh in your mind, what's from your perspective, Jerome, what's the key message that you would love buyers, the key message that you would love listeners to take away from our conversation?
I think that the takeaway is if you're a seller, you've put all this time and energy into building your business. You've done a fantastic job. To get to this point, you're in the top, 1% of 1% of companies.
Yeah, give yourself
now. Yeah, give yourself a pat. Now the next phase, it's a totally different endeavor, different from building your business, and but there is a process and there is a way to do this. And if you follow these steps, and these are just some of the steps, but if you follow these steps, you are going to have a successful exit. I can promise you that. So there is a way forward. There is a path forward to an exit.
Absolutely. Well, we've got 21 steps that we follow. I'm sure you would have a few more of your own. But what the consistent message I'm hearing is planning and preparation. And my dad was in the army, and he taught me that proper planning prevents poor performance. But when he shared it with me, there are a few more P's in there, which I'll leave to your imagination.
No, I think there's a Navy SEAL saying that says, we don't rise to the occasion, we sink to our level of preparation, which is probably about what your dad was saying.
More military terms, and I'm sure they're just as colourful. Hey, Jerome, look, thanks for sharing your insights with us today. It's been enlightening. I've learned a few things, been reminded of a few things. I appreciate you sharing on the Exit Insights podcast.
Thank you so much, Daryl, for having me. Thank you to your listeners for tuning in.